Hello, good morning, everybody. Nice to meet you again for the third day of conferences. And today, the topic of this conference is demonstrators and low carbon solutions. So let's start. Première intervenante, donc Abha Narain Lambah. So good morning, Abha. Nice to meet you or to hear you at the moment. And it's a great pleasure to welcome you. Thank you for accepting our invitation. So I'm going to introduce you. You are a graduate of School of Planning and Architecture in New Delhi. And you began your career with Joseph Allenstein as an architect in the India Habitat Center project. For the last 25 years, you have been working on a range of architecture, urban and conservation projects in Mumbai and all across India. You have won, I think, many prizes, and your architectural practice has won, in particular, the Architectural Digest Architect of the Year Award in 2019, is it right? 2019, yeah. And for over 2 decades, the practice is focused on museum projects across the country that include the comprehensive management plan and design of galleries and museums, such as Nehru Memorial Museum, Library in Delhi, Textile Mill Museum Mumbai, as well as exhibition design for Kunstkamera Museum in St. Petersburg. That is very, very impressive. And so I would like to now, okay, I can see you now. Good morning.
Good morning. Such a pleasure to be here.
Yeah.
I look forward to engaging with everyone.
Okay, so please take over.
Well, I hope you can see my screen.
Yes, we do.
Okay. So it's an honor to be a part of this conference and looking at carbon neutral strategy from the perspective of South Asia and especially the Indian context. I think what's relevant from my point of view, being an architect whose work has largely been in the realm of conservation and preservation, is to review where we are heading. After independence that we as a nation received 75 years ago, we were influenced by various factors. There was a need for some people to break away from the history, from the past, because it was a painful past. There was also a great influence of Le Corbusier with Chandigarh, the city being built. But what it did over the last few decades is a shift from our roots. And therefore, there was this almost urge, a kind of what was fashionable for Indian architects to adopt Western prototypes. So you would see in the last few decades, our traditional construction systems have been swapped for glass facades. It works for the Northern Hemisphere in Paris, but not necessarily a hot, dry, humid, part of India, whether it is in northern Rajasthan or in the south of India. And therefore, it begs the question, and it requires us as practitioners and architects to ask the question, what is building of a sustainable future and carbon neutral strategy in construction in the Indian context? And I have a photograph of the Taj Mahal to remind all of us that as a country, we've had 4 millennia of built heritage. And yet, architecturally, in the contemporary architectural context, we're a rather nascent country. And that then requires us to ask the question, what is sustainable architecture and what is the greenest building? As quoted by Sherban Cantacuzino, and to my mind, the greenest building is one that already exists. And for a nation of 1.3 billion people, what is also important is whether our architecture our construction industry, which is the second largest employer of people in the country, whether we are really using our strongest resource of manpower or woman power. And therefore, perhaps the answer to sustainable and net zero construction might be very different in India as it is to Europe, because here we are not trying to minimize labor and manpower. We actually need to utilize that resource and at the same time reduce our dependency on materials that are out, that we need to import from a long distance. We need to travel, transport through long distances that add to our carbon footprint. And therefore, this simple case of the Hawa Mahal or the Rajasthan architecture, which is so relevant even today, even though it's 300 years old, what is so relevant today is that all it uses is what is locally available. So the Jaipur Hawa Mahal was built of local sandstone, was built of lime mortar and lime plasters that were prepared with local materials, local workmanship, and then given a color of a red ochre, which was again available right in the area. But what lifted it from just a building to great architecture was the level of craftsmanship. And that perhaps is something that architecture and Indian architecture in the last couple of decades has completely forgotten about. When we see the transformation in the Indian context, this is in the heart of old Delhi, the capital city, which was the capital city of the Mughals. And what you see to the left is an old photograph that shows dense urban fabric, but local materials, a kind of an architecture that responded to the climate, that had sunbreakers, that had chicks, which were retractable blinds to cut out the sun. And what it's being replaced by in the last few decades is a lot of glazing, which not necessarily works for a country like India. That creates a reliance on air conditioning and basically a kind of architecture that is alien and definitely not sustainable for a country like India. If we go up to the hills, to the mountain, the Himalayan region, and towns across the Himalayan region, which are springing up at a very rapid rate. And given our population explosion, the amount of construction activity is intense. We look at a city, a town like Shimla, which is in a very, very fragile seismic zone, which is because the Himalayas are one of the youngest mountain ranges and very active still. And when we see this kind of large-scale RCC construction, one wonders if this is something that we need to address from the point of view of both carbon neutral as well as the kind of sustainability challenges it offers. Because really, is this kind of architecture of that's reliant, and yes, we were truly inspired as a generation of architects by the European concepts of first Latins in Delhi and then Corbusier. But to just implant that on an Indian landscape is not always the answer. And that begs the question of what needs our attention. What are we leaving for the next generation of South Asians and especially Indians, where the population numbers are going to be, we are already 1/5 of the world population, and at the rate we are going, that's a large chunk of the human population of the next generation that we as architects and practitioners and engineers in the construction industry need to be responsible for. Are we creating an architecture that we would be proud to leave behind? Or are we using up all the resources that are meant to be passed to the next generation? So what really should be the priority for a country like India or for an entire region like South Asia? The answer perhaps would be to go local. We have a very rich traditional building crafts, we have a very large resource of construction industry manpower. And at the same time, each region is very, very different from another region when we look at a large country, which is really like a subcontinent of India. And therefore, while in the north, you could have a hilly terrain with mud architecture, as we see in Ladakh, where the architecture, which is local, is largely timber and mud, to brick architecture in the Punjab, stone across the western and central regions, and then very hard stone and granites down the south. And at this point, the question is, for contemporary architecture today, are we really exploring what is local in terms of climatic consciousness as well as material availability, and whether sustainable methods and practices in the construction industry need to be promoted at a much greater level. This also requires infrastructure that respects the local techniques and a revival and support of the local crafts economy, local skills, and traditional sources of construction wisdom. This is an example of a project that I worked on for 3 years, right at the region, the northernmost region of India, which is Ladakh. This terrain is very, very dry. It's high altitude at 11,000 feet, with very intense winters where we have minus 40 degrees Celsius temperature in the winter time. And this project had been declared by the World Monuments Fund as among the 50 most endangered monuments of the world. This is a 15th century Buddhist temple that is largely built of mud blocks and rammed earth, and with a little bit of timber. The roofs are flat timber with mud terracing, and the entire structure, which was built in the 15th century, is perched on top of a hill, which was only accessed by foot. In the winter months, this area becomes unapproachable, the land routes are blocked, and there's enough snow to prevent any work happening on site. And when the World Monuments Fund declared this as a fragile and an endangered monument, the villagers of Vasgo, the local villagers, came up with a great idea. For the Wilson Challenge program, they challenged World Monuments Fund to spend 50% of the money if they matched it. But instead of matching 50% of dollars, they matched it with their local labor. So every villager, this was the temple, which was timber and mud. So really an earth structure with timber tensile members. And because it had the most beautiful historic wall paintings, it was even more fragile. So what the villagers did was to come up with this matching grant idea, where they matched the US dollars provided by World Monuments Fund with local material and local labor. So the use of willow, which was required to rebuild the slabs internally, were provided by every villager, because every village household would have one willow tree in its backyard. And each village household provided the local timber from their household. The local people provided the labor, and therefore we were able to do this entire project without using labor from outside of the region. In the absence of a motorized road, the villagers created human chains to carry material up the hill. And this would happen every weekend when they would come back from work to their homes, and over the weekends give their time and effort as their contribution to their temple. And finally, we started the project in 2004 with the local monks, the Buddhist monks, doing a puja to deconsecrate the temple so that we as as the team could take off. And even in terms of the carbon footprint of the team, the entire conservation project was led by the local craftsmen, the local community. I was the outsider in a sense. I was an architect who was part of the project and had to come in from outside of Ladakh. But other than that, the local engineer, there were no local engineers, there were no contractors. The work of the engineer and contractor was really done by the local community of the village, because they understood this architecture way better on an empirical, almost an intrinsic level. Initially, when we had planned this project, it had been planned by a structural engineer with steel scaffolding, props, and a completely steel intervention. When I took on the project as consultant, I questioned this and wondered how it would impact the carbon footprint of the project, as also the fact that tomorrow, or 10 years down the line, if the local community were to repair or maintain the structure, how would they be able to do it if the materials used were alien to their region? So we decided, after a lot of intervention and innovations and experimentation, that instead of using a steel scaffold, instead of using any modern construction material, we would rely on the local material. So we created, on the left, you can see, 2 very tall buttresses were built in local mud blocks that were prepared on site. And this was used to shore up the facade of the temple before we took up the rest of the structural repair. The local community helped with this, in a sense, the collection of local grasses, 4 kinds of local muds, zasa, markhala, various clays, as well as mud that was used to prepare the conservation materials for the restoration project. And over 3 years, we worked between the months of May and October, because those were the only months when we could work on site without electricity, without running water, and working and living in the village, that we worked on this project and its conservation. This is a photograph of the local team. They were all, barring 2 architects, the workforce were constituted of local Ladakhi villagers, as well as the erstwhile king of Ladakh, Jigme Namgyal, and the Namgyal Foundation that supported this project. We realized that instead of doing very major interventions in steel supports, all we needed was to replace some of the broken wooden brackets that had been damaged due to the shear force. And these were crafted in wood that was brought in from Kashmir Valley and then carved locally to be able to replace the damaged brackets. We used local car jacks to lift the structure while we were inserting each and every wooden bracket. And using very simple methods and very simple technology, we restored this building. This took 3 years, but it won UNESCO's Award of Excellence, the UNESCO Asia Pacific Award of Excellence. And that this was in 2006, 2007. And that informed my practice, that in the last 20 odd years, we have endeavored to bring in as much local material, local know-how, and local labor force for projects of conservation across India. This is another part of the country, which is Punjab. This is, again, north, but the plains, the river plains of Punjab, and some of the most beautiful Sikh palaces and forts are from this region. This region was also witness to a very, very traumatic partition of India and Pakistan, where the region of Punjab was divided over 2 countries. And perhaps because of those scars, for 75 years, Punjab and the people of Punjab looked at being more progressive, looked towards the future, but in a way forgot their past. And over 7 decades of absolute neglect to these structures that were made of brick and lime mortar had caused severe damage and abandonment of these palaces. However, inside are some of the most beautiful craftsmanship of ceilings, of Khatambandi ceilings, of Aleppo glass and gold, and chandeliers that were purchased in bulk from Offler and Company, because there's a story that the Maharaja had gone in the early 1920s to go shopping, and he was told by the shopkeeper that he couldn't afford a chandelier, so he just bought the whole shop instead. We here worked with local craftsmen, but the problem is that in 70 years, when no conservation had happened, the local traditional techniques of lime mortar, of stuccos, using local limestones and mortars had been completely lost because everyone was using Portland cement. So we found and identified 2 old craftsmen who were in their 80s that you can see the photographs of. And these craftsmen remembered from their youth the use of lime and local materials in building. These we asked to train the younger generation and were able to create a kind of a revival, a training boot camp, where the older generation of craftsmen were able to move there, to transfer their knowledge and traditional wisdom to a younger and a newer generation of workmen. This led to various projects across Punjab. This is a caravanserai from the period of the Mughal Emperor Jahangir. And here, again, some sections had collapsed, where we realized that the best way to reuse and adaptively reuse these buildings is the best way to continue their relevance to modern society. But to do that, we needed to reconstruct many of these collapsed and severely damaged cells. So the entire vaulting was done using old Mughal brick, using very traditional vaulting mechanisms as exactly how the Mughals would have built them. And through a process of on-site training, through a process of very careful documentation before and after, we were able to reconstruct the vaulted arches using the very traditional techniques and to be able to put this building to a contemporary use. Another project is that of the Moorish Mosque. It's a very French-inspired design because the architect was French. Maharaja Jagatjit Singh of Kapurthala was one of the greatest Francophiles among Indian Maharajas. And in 1930, when most of the other princely states were designing in the British style, he chose a French architect to design this mosque, which was almost a copy of the Qutubiyya Masjid in the Qutubiyya Mosque in Morocco. Over 70 years, this had also badly been damaged. And then we started this process of restoration. As you can see with the center photograph is the photograph of a very old craftsman. He was in his late 80s who had worked on the construction of this building. And we asked him to train the younger craftsmen using local materials to restore this monument. To the left is the grandson of Maharaja Jagatjit Singh, Brigadier Sukhjit Singh, who was an invaluable source of information because he had been a very young boy when the project had been commissioned. And gradually restoring the lime stuccos, restoring the woodwork, restoring the marble flooring, we put this building together piece by piece, and now it's been restored back to use. What makes us wonder is that when you have architecture that is responsive to the climate, why could we not use these as templates to build new buildings? All these buildings that we see across India are based on a very strong traditional craftsman that bridges local communities and new architecture. And at the same time, there's a lot of buildings that face abandonment and absolute dereliction. So over the last few years, we have worked on various conservation and adaptive reuse projects, because to our mind, a green building is one that exists already. So there is a very vast building stock of old warehouses, old pumping stations, structures that were built but not used. And therefore, to give them a new use, whether it is converting a 100-year-old pump house in Jaipur into, which was used for the city to provide water to the city of Jaipur. It's been turned into a cafe and a museum. We converted an old fire station into a bookshop and a cafe in Shimla at the Viceregal Lodge. This is in Hyderabad in southern India. And this architecture of Hyderabad was a combination of, again, very Islamic as well as French influences. And Chowmahala Palace in Hyderabad was a project that we worked on for 8 years. This was completely abandoned and derelict and used a combination of stone and brick masonry with lime plasters. We worked with over 8 years to restore this monument, working with local craftsmen, rebuilding a kind of a palette of materials that would be local to this area. And building by building, block by block, we restored these derelict, unkept spaces to give them new use. These have been since 2008, been used as a cultural space within the city of Hyderabad. And by giving back these spaces to the city, what it does is to provide a sense of identity to the city and also employment. Another such project is in Delhi, which is the adaptive reuse of an old princely house into Delhi's cultural destination. This is Bikaner House, which some other projects across Rajasthan, where we opted for converting old palaces into museums, bringing in tourists to to revive the economy, using stone for stone, and then coming to Bombay, where various entire cultural spaces or urban spaces have been enlivened by using public support for a city that has a very high density of population and has one of the lowest open space ratios in the world. We worked with the Kala Ghoda Association to transform parking lots over weekends into urban spaces, to transform steps of historic buildings as open air amphitheaters, and to use up every square inch of space for culture. And by doing that, we are also recycling buildings, because we all talk of recycling water, paper, recycling energy. But in a city like Bombay, where we have a lot of old buildings, recycling old buildings is often the most sustainable way of construction, because these buildings sometimes have a lot of many years of life ahead of them. And just by minor interventions, we are able to extend the life of these buildings. So some of these projects across the city of Mumbai have been able to recycle buildings that were derelict or multiple tenanted, to convert them into public use, to open up stores, to restore historic structures of the Gothic period. This is the University Convocation Hall by Sir Gilbert Scott. And this was the condition we found it in. And this has been restored, and it not only is used now by the university students, but is used for cultural debates, for music performances, and other events throughout the year. This is an old derelict building in the heart of Mumbai in Gamdevi, which was an old school that had shut down. And this was converted into a women's art university. Minor changes to make it more contemporary. This is a Jewish synagogue in the heart of Kala Ghoda, in the heart of Mumbai's cultural district. And the synagogue, the number of people, the community of the Baghdadi Jewish community had shrunk to very few numbers. And therefore, just to maintain and upkeep the synagogue was a challenge. We brought in corporate social responsibility funds and local businesses to help restore this beautiful synagogue and restore the paints, remove the paint off the wood, go back to the original color palette, and restore and keep all the historic materials, whether it was the old Minton floor tiles that had been imported from Stoke-on-Trent, or the historic stained glass that was restored by Indian conservators in Mumbai. This building, once it's been restored, is being given back to the community. And yet another project, which was very French inspired, which was a historic building called the Royal Opera House. The Royal Opera House is India's only opera house, and it was built to create one of the finest, it was called the finest opera east of the Suez. And this building in the 1960s had been turned from a performance theater to a cinema hall. And then after the 80s, when large single theater cinema screens became out of fashion, this became abandoned. And for 20 years and more, it was abandoned and derelict and had just been in a city like Bombay with so much rain and monsoon, the building had been declared completely unsafe. We started on this project, and every time I would go to an engineer, 5 of the top engineers in the city denied working on this project. They refused to work on it because it was in such a bad shape. And this is what it looked like. You could feel the steel work with your fingernails. There were sections that had collapsed. The balcony was teetering on the verge of collapse, and the government had declared it structurally unsafe. We started with this project, and what seemed odd to our team and me at that point was why a building that was so baroque in its architecture had an Art Deco interior when it was built before the Art Deco period. So we did a lot of research. We found a lot of old photographs. We also researched through a lot of old Hindi films because a lot of movies were initially shot in this historic hall. And we realized that this entire shell of an interior that was Art Deco had been put in at a later date. So we went back to peeling off the layers, and we found the old balconies that had been blocked up. And this has been restored ever since. What this has done is, however, create an amazing cultural space within the city. By recycling this building and reviving this building, what happened was a complete, where the city of Bombay came to embrace this structure. And ever since the structure has been opened in 2016, it's now 6 years, this has really become the most favored cultural destination of Mumbai. And by restoring this building and by recycling this building, we have been able to create a carbon neutral, something like this really helps keep the balance when you compare it to the kind of crazy construction activity that is happening around the neighborhood. And by this, I just feel that if today in a country like India, we are gradually able to at least keep, restore, recycle, and reuse some of our buildings, if we are able to build new buildings in areas like Ladakh using local mud and timber, if we can build using local material, we would be definitely a country that would be able to reach this effort and reach this target by 2015. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Abha. I was particularly pleased to hear you today because you remind us that not always maybe, but very often traditional buildings or traditional cities and districts are sustainable. And this is what we have to keep in mind. And we should not always make the clean slate of all the past, but learn from the past. And this is the case for Paris, the inner city of Paris as an example, which is really sustainable, more than maybe the suburb or new cities. So thank you for your presentation and for your experience.